Good afternoon, everyone. I've actually just come out of Darfur, so I've just reached Adre, where I'll be spending the night tonight, seeing our local teams here and judging how the response is going across the border. This is a crucial border crossing, but I've had a week inside Darfur, which is now the epicenter of human suffering in the world. My aims going in were firstly to understand and confront the perils that civilians that are facing every day in Darfur. Second, to break open genuine access, real access for our humanitarian colleagues to the communities who are hit the hardest. And thirdly, to demand an international response which is more vigorous and rooted in genuine humanity and courage, along the lines of the briefing I gave the Security Council a couple of weeks ago. And so in the course of the last week, I met leaders, frontline responders, and of course, most importantly, the people who are living through this crisis every day. And you can see on the various social media feeds clips of many of those discussions. The itinerary was, I started in Port Sudan, then went through the Adre crossing, via Janina, spent the night in Golo, courtesy of our friends at Save the Children, then on to Tawila for a couple of nights, where I was put up by our friends at the Norwegian Refugee Council, then back via last night in Titi, and then back through Janina and through the Adre crossing, and I'll go on now to Anjamina tomorrow. In Port Sudan, I met, of course, General Borhan. I also had a very useful meeting, a joint meeting with the foreign ministers of Egypt and Sudan. And there, the real focus was on getting unlimited access, unhindered access everywhere that we need it, and security for our convoys and our personnel. It's very clear to me, has been since my first week in the job when I visited Sudan and visited Darfur, that we need more UN boots on the ground. The UN is a ship that was not built to stay in the harbour. And this visit has been part of that big push to make sure we're mobilised closer to those we serve. Then, of course, Darfur was the kind of the core of the visit. It's an absolute horror show, as many of you have been reporting. Fasher, based on the testimonies I heard from many survivors, is basically a crime scene right now. I was here this week as part of a sustained effort across the UN leadership, actually. So Amy Pope of the IOM, as you heard earlier this week, or at the end of last week, Carl Scow of the WFP were also here. And this is now part of a 5 to 6 week sustained push across several senior UN leaders to get in and surge that engagement in response to what we're hearing from Fasher and more widely. Amazingly impressed as ever by the grit of our UN and NGO staff in Tawila on the front line. This is one of the most challenging environments that we work in, and they're doing extraordinary work. I went on from Tawila to even closer to Fasher, to Korma, where many of those who've escaped are currently based. And again, heard so many stories of misery and horror from people there. But that real desire that people have for the world to hear their stories, and I'll share a couple of those stories in a moment. You know, it's striking when you meet our teams across Sudan, how many of them themselves are internally displaced people and who have lost loved ones. I did an all-staff meeting online as I drove up the road through Janina, and one of my colleagues, now based in Khartoum, but originally from Fasher, said that having not seen his aunt for a year and a half, he saw her in the background of one of my videos yesterday, and it was confirmation that she was alive. So our staff are also survivors of this conflict. In Korma, as you may have seen, I also met with the RSF representatives. It was a tough discussion. I set out unequivocally that we will be expecting protection for civilians, that we will be insisting, not asking for accountability, and insisting, again, not asking for safe passage for civilians to get out and for our convoys and aid to get in. The deliberate attacks on civilians, and I heard so many stories of these, must stop, and we want those who commit these crimes to face justice. Of course, we're not just dealing with Darfur, we've also got to keep our eyes on the Kordofans. It's important we investigate the atrocities that have happened in Fasher, but also that we are working to prevent future atrocities. The needs, of course, are massive. Nearly 2 in every 3 people in Sudan needs aid right now. 11 months into the year, we're at 32% funded of the 4 billion that we need for 2025. And again, as I've described to you after previous visits, I'm seeing the impact, the huge impact, the brutal life and death choices we're making as a result of aid cuts. And just a reminder that all we're asking for to save 114 million lives is 1% of what the world is currently spending on arms and defense. Just to close, a few highlights of what I saw, some outcomes and some takeaways. 1/3 of the people arriving in Fasher are malnourished. 15% of children under the age of 5 are suffering the deadliest form of malnutrition. It's a crisis that hits children hardest. 1 in 5 people killed in Fasher was a child. And I met so many kids who are carrying their younger siblings to safety, strangers picking up babies on the road when the parents of those children are killed. I met one woman in one of the clinics that we're supporting who had seen her own husband killed in front of her and had escaped, and her neighbor, and had escaped with the malnourished child of her neighbor, had to make that perilous walk to Tawila, going through so many checkpoints where people are being fleeced, they're having everything taken from them. En route, while she carried this malnourished baby, she had her leg broken by men on one of those checkpoints. And I think you can probably fill in the rest of that story. A horror show, absolute horror show. Countless stories like that. It's a sexual violence epidemic, as you know. And our healthcare partners are reporting that they're getting up to 250 people arriving daily with gunshot and torture wounds. I was very struck a couple of nights ago, wandering up to chat to a group of kids just outside where we were staying, and it was all smiles and it was all happy. And I noticed one of the kids was wearing an English football top, a Man City football top. And I just went to point at the logo on the top, and this kid recoiled away from me in terror. These kids have been through so much. Some of the outcomes, briefly, we have, I think, a pretty strong agreement from the authorities in Port Sudan and the RSF on full access and safe passage for our convoys to go in and for civilians to get out. Now, let's see what happens next. Let's see if they live up to those commitments they've made to me. But we will call out those blockages, as I told the Security Council just 2 weeks ago. When we're blocked, we will say so. We made progress on getting our teams into Fasher on UN terms. We're not going to be instrumentalized. As I say, this is a potential crime scene, and we've got to make sure we've got the right people going in, and that the aid is genuinely neutral and impartial when it does go in. We have a surge of UN staff to Darfur. When I left, I had a meeting with 28 UN staff now based in Tawila at the moment. That's a huge increase on what we've had even 3 months ago. And I've also been doing throughout this trip very close liaison. I've been in daily contact with Dr. Boulos at the White House and with the Quad more widely in other member states on the need for this massive diplomatic push. I think there is potentially a moment of opportunity here if the international community is ready to seize it. And we need the Security Council, we need member states to be much clearer on protection of civilians, on humanitarian access, on limiting these flows of arms which are doing such damage to civilians, and on ensuring we get accountability and investigations. I'll stop there, but just one final reflection. That's something I've learned on this trip. This has been physically the toughest mission I've done this week, and I've seen really close up how tough these access challenges really are. I wanted to get up that road to show that it could be done and show that we needed to get our convoys moving up that road, but it's a brutal 2 to 3 day journey. Along the way, another UN convoy that was following us, a UNICEF convoy, was caught up in an airstrike on a commercial vehicle, and our colleagues were shaken up and injured in that. On the way back, we were caught up in a huge forest fire, which was a pretty dicey moment, one of our vehicles had a crash, and of course we're going through checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint, manned by these different military groups. I say manned. In many cases, these are not men on the checkpoints; they're kids. And that constant reminder of the dangers that our teams face and the risks we run. But as I say, we're going to get that blue flag flying as close as possible to the people we serve. And this mission, that was our number one objective.